For the City Council workshop for October 26, 2020. Kristen Rush, if you'll do the roll call.
Mayor Williams.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Miller.
Here.
Councilmember Pfeiffer.
Here.
Councilmember Ford.
Here.
Councilmember Jones.
Here.
Councilmember Marriott.
Here.
Councilmember Simpson.
Mr. Marriott.
Thank you, Your Honor. I've moved that we excuse Councilmember Simpson for tonight.
Motions to excuse. Votes are cast. That passes 6-0. She's put this out on Facebook, so it's no secret that Lauren lost her beloved grandmother here a couple of weeks ago, and she's down in Texas for a memorial service. Very good. Next, we are going to have a communications and engagement strategy update. Deputy City Manager Lori Gillis, do you want to start us off?
You bet. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council. The purpose of this workshop agenda item is to provide an update on the city team's progress in implementing a comprehensive communication engagement strategy and to receive feedback from City Council about current and longer-term strategies, recognizing the need to evolve how the City of Arvada engages and communicates with various segments of our community and the city team. City Council included a strategic result in its 2020-2025 strategic plan that by December 2020, the city would implement a comprehensive communications and engagement strategy. Tonight, Chief Communications Manager Ben Irwin will provide a presentation and update to City Council.
Very good. Mr. Irwin.
Mayor, members of council, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. As I was reflecting, I was driving my mom up to Estes Park yesterday so she could check on her house, and I was driving in a snowstorm and thinking about some of the themes I wanted to really underscore tonight. And you consider the pandemic, the fires, everything. We have been through a lot, and a lot has changed since I spoke to you about a year ago and introduced the communications and engagement strategy.
First of all, is your mother's place okay?
It is. Thank you
Very
for
good.
asking. Yes, it is. We're grateful for that. And so, it'd be fair for people to ask, why is now a time to talk about communications and engagement? And I think what I hope to convey tonight, as we talk about some of the results and the progress we've made in implementing a communications and engagement strategy, I hope that I'm able to convince people watching this presentation that now is exactly the right time to be talking about communications and engagement, that we need it now more than ever. Bruce, if we could go to the next slide, please. And before I get started, I really needed to just convey that I am the messenger here of a host of different projects and work that could not have been possible without everyone, person or organization listed here, as well as a host of others. Indeed, we have a core team of communications and engagement professionals within the city manager's office, but we also have them across the rest of the organization. And I appreciate all of the tireless work across all of your focus areas and our work systems in the organization to make us any success we've realized so far possible. We also have several consultants and a host of community partners that help us be successful. So you see some of our partners in the lower right, not here, not mentioned because of spaces, Arvada Center, Apex, Park and Recreation District, and a host of others, Arvada Fire. All of them are critical partners in addition to a host of staff across the organization. So I just wanted to make that clear. Bruce, we can go to the next slide. So here's what we're going to cover tonight. I'd like to take a moment to reiterate the alignment. And when we say alignment, we're talking about that golden thread, that thing, the things that we do on a daily basis that connect with the council's overarching goals and objectives. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how communications and engagement in our organization does that and fulfills community and council objectives. Then I'm going to reintroduce the strategy, just provide a little context about what we're talking about and get into the component pieces a little bit. And then we'll get to the good stuff. I'm really excited to talk about the progress we've made. We also have some information for you tonight around the results. We think we have some good results that are signs that we're headed in the right direction. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps and what we're looking forward to in the next year. So Bruce, next slide, please. So first, that alignment piece. You can see here the City Council's 2020 to 2025 strategic plan. And it's a really good time to sort of just remind everyone, I talked about it in more detail last year, But there's been a solid effort over the last decade or more to focus on different types of community engagement and communications in the city. If you look at our sector...
Excuse me. We need to take a pause for a second to check the audio on the TV. I'm getting some text that they cannot be heard.
Sure.
Hold on,
Okay.
please.
Plan. You think about the recent update to the Land Development Code. These are building on the work that's been here. But still, we still have indications through previous community survey results, through council's own visioning process in 2018, that we had a lot of room for improvement as well. So, Bruce, if you could go to the next slide, please. And so as part of the strategic planning process, council identified a strategic result in your latest strategic plan that by June 2021, we will have implemented a comprehensive city communications and engagement strategy. And again, that's what I'm here today to talk about, is the progress in implementing that plan. I want to note that this is the organizational and service effectiveness. This is a strategic result within that focus area of the strategic plan. But the other strategic plans, infrastructure, community economic development, safe community, and so on, they all have strategic results and principles that also both support our communications and engagement and help and benefit from it. So Bruce, we can go to the next slide, please. Okay. Just going to touch a moment on reorient to the overall strategy structure. And Bruce, that's on the next slide. There's three main parts. There's an engagement framework, which we spent a lot of time with during the last presentation and over this year. It is our promise to the community about why we care about good public involvement, how we're going to execute it. We'll touch on this in a little bit more detail, and I think you'll recall it even more as we talk about how we manage expectations for different levels of engagement depending on what we want to achieve. There's supporting strategies, which I'm going to spend a lot of time on. And then the third part is planning and implementation. So this is the how, the kind of plans and guidelines and meetings and performance measures we're tracking and developing still to make sure we're doing the work and achieving these results. So Bruce, if you could go to the next slide, please. So going to spend a lot of time, I'm sorry, there we go. Yeah, going to spend a lot of time on the supporting strategies. And again, note those four focus areas of our strategy. There's community engagement, internal and external communications, and marketing. And the marketing piece we'll talk a little bit more in the future, a bit later, but that was feedback from council that said we need to tell our story better. We need to talk about the voice of the customer, integrate it into what we're talking about, not just deliver information about our policies, projects, and services, but tell that story from a perspective of our community. And so we're endeavoring to do that. But keep those four in mind, because I want to go now to the next slide. And this is really in the weeds. This is pretty boring, I think, but it's so critical to me. It's that this is how we fund this work, at least in the city manager's office. A program, for people watching, is the way in which we deliver the budget to different services and work in the city. And up to this point, we've conducted at least that core work within the city manager's office across two programs, external and internal communications. So I just wanted to take a beat to let you know that what we've done is restructured a little bit. If we go to the next slide, we've added two more. And so now we've taken the resources that are in that program And we've distributed them out and identified them so they match and support the strategic areas in our overall strategy. So you see community engagement, external and internal communications. And then what we've done is both through funding and changing how we frame the team, taking like Arvada Media Services and our print shop, some of the creative work we do, and put it into a creative services area that really supports our marketing efforts. So we can go to the next slide now. With that out of the way, we can start to talk a little bit about the progress that we've all made across the city. And in the next slide, we'll start with our community engagement. This is the graphic I was hoping you'd recognize in people at home. This is our engagement spectrum. We've borrowed this heavily from the International Association of Public Participation, the professional organization of which the city's now a member and participates in their training and professional development opportunities. But essentially what this does, this is a fundamental graphic for our engagement framework because it outlines a spectrum of levels of involvement. So you can see under inform, we are informing our community about things that we want them to know about and providing opportunities for feedback and questions. But as you move farther to the right of that spectrum, you get more and more in-depth engagement, all the way to empower, where a classic example is we ask our community members to vote on park equipment as part of our Taking Lasting Care program. So all along the way, we've identified the kinds of activities and expectations that people will have, and we want to marry the type of decisions we need to make and the information we want to get from our public to that level of engagement, so everybody's on the same page and knows what to expect. Other ways we've implemented it, I'm really proud of the partnership that I have with Noelle Oberg and the team that is over implementing organizational development. We've developed a training for our city team to help apply this spectrum to individual communication and projects that are happening in the city. We developed a community engagement guide, which we featured heavily in an earlier edition of this year, I think a spring edition of the Arvada report, which gives people 10 specific things they can do right now to get involved and get more engaged in their local government. And that all of this information, as well as that engagement guide, is at arvada.org/engage. So just hope people can go and check that out. And then we're seeing more use, particularly within our infrastructure work system, of Speak Up Arvada. Incredibly important tool. I'm going to take a deeper dive in a moment on that. But we're proud that we're applying this framework to our use of Speak Up Arvada, and we're seeing more topics on there, on a greater variety of topics. Bruce, let's go to the next slide, please. Internal communications is a focus area because our approach is inside out. If we want to be successful in communicating and engaging with our community and our customers, we need to be very successful in engaging with our staff and our city team and making sure that they have the information they need to feel successful, to grow their professional work, as well as be our best assets in the field and on the ground, conveying information about the city, receiving information that they're hearing from our community about what's working, maybe what's not working so well, so we can respond to it. So that's why we put so much of an emphasis on internal communication. Again, our partnership with HR and working closely with folks like Noelle is integral to this, but there's a host of other people that help. Our biggest achievement this year, so far over the last 12 months or so since we've spoken, has been to launch a brand new Inside Arvada. Now, my hope for our community is that they don't spend a lot of time thinking about an internal website or an internet and whether or not their city team has one. But I want you to know that we've put a lot of effort into this because it's important for us to have a digital place to store all the information we want people to be able to find. The forms, the sign-up sheets, the overviews of some of the internal programs, committees, and opportunities that are available, as well as things like Arvada University and having a home for that here. So it's been really important, a huge lift. It was developed by, I would say, more than 70 different people across the organization through different types of engagement, probably more if you include some of the other engagement we did, and a core team from representatives of across the organization. So we're really excited about that. Another thing you hopefully have noticed is you get the weekly briefs, Council, every week, an update of the things we really want our team to know. And that is now developed collaboratively on a shared document. I don't know the exact number of people that contribute to it, but every work system offers information, and that's where that information comes from. In the future, we want to leverage Inside Arvada to make that even more streamlined, so that when we update something on Inside Arvada, it automatically updates the next weekly briefs, but we're working on that. It's somewhat a function of our response to the pandemic. But we're proud of our approach to the Everyone Zoom meetings and the MMT Zoom meetings, and I'll talk more about COVID-19 certainly in a moment. But what we're doing is quarterly meetings with our staff, with the whole city team. And we're getting 50, 60% of our team to participate in that, either live during the meeting or by watching the recording later. And that's tremendous participation for an all-team meeting, so to speak. And then the MMT Zoom meetings happen once a month. This is integral. We talk about it in our weekly briefs. We talk about it in Everyone Zooms. It's on inside Arvada. It's also important to empower our managers to carry that message to their teams directly. So that's something that we've added and continue to grow. I think it's making communication easier and more effective. And the last thing, I just wanted to highlight something that really stuck with us, particularly with our Arvada Media Services team, but everyone's really took this to heart. Council's recommendation that we feature city team members more. We tell the story of them as human beings, humanize staff, and show what they do on a daily basis and how that relates to what we're trying to achieve for the community. So I thought this is roughly the halfway point of the presentation. I thought it'd be a good time to maybe just take a minute to share one of these videos. It's essentially an opportunity for somebody on the city team to take 30 to 60 seconds to talk about their job, why they love working for Arvada, and how it supports your objectives. So Bruce, could we switch over to just show that video for a second?
My name is Emily Yoshihara. I'm a civil engineer in community and economic development. I am Arvada. My main focus is development review. My team works alongside planning and building to get plans reviewed and improved so that developers can take their projects into construction. It's really rewarding to see new development in Arvada that citizens can utilize and something that they want that meets their needs. COVID-19 has definitely thrown a wrench in our everyday routines. While there's been some challenges, I use coworkers that can bark all of the time as you can get on Zoom calls. There's also been some really great benefits. Our team has found some great efficiency in meetings, and so we usually have pre-construction meetings before a project goes into construction. And we found it really efficient that everyone can just hop on a Zoom call rather than meeting in person. And all the contracting developers really seem to like this, so it's really neat to kind of experiment with those things to see if we can utilize them moving forward.
Great. Okay. What's exciting about that is that was the first one we did since we started working remotely in response to the pandemic. This whole thing was really developed by Arvada Media Services, and Tomas Martinez, you all know him fairly well. He came up with this concept, and now he's created instructions. So council, we're ready for your I Am Arvada videos. We have the instructions ready to go, but anybody on the team can do one of these, and then we add it to our LinkedIn profile. We share it mostly with our city team to kind of build some pride in what we're doing, but it's a really great tool, and we're starting to release some that people shot themselves, and they're doing a fantastic job, so look for that.
Ms. Miller.
Ben, I love these so much. I think they're absolutely fantastic. We're excited to ours. We got the invitation to sign up, so that's super fun. I would love if we could put a little bit more about the personal of the person. Like, I would have loved to have known what that jersey was on the back of her, on that wall, and what her dog's name was. But these are so great. I love them. Congratulations.
Oh, good. Well,
School of Mines is what was in that jersey. An engineer. Yeah, I agree. I just want to add, I want to agree with her as well. I'd like to know the person a little bit more and then maybe talk about their job, because I think that's the whole intent is, again, going back to the humanizing of our staff and our teams.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. That's great. So we'll go to the next slide, please, Bruce. So now we're going to transition to external communications. So once we've informed our internal team, we're ready to go out in the community and start communicating with them. And we've made integral to this, these are a couple of slides that are going to be around some of the inside baseball stuff in the weeds, but it's critically important. And this is really a slide about gratitude for the team across the city, starting with infrastructure and community and economic development, who now have work system specific communications plans that both meet directly the objectives of those work systems, but also tie into the overarching communications strategy. So credit goes to Rachel Kuroiwa and Allison Tremblay, who are the communications managers for those two work systems respectively. And then VCN actually has a Vibrant Communities and Neighborhoods actually also has a group of folks that are developing their plan right now. We're really excited about that. And then Safe Community and the police department, they have standard operating procedures and community engagement planning that we tie into on a weekly basis through Detective Dave Snelling and other members of their team. So it's really feeling good, and I appreciate everybody's efforts to integrate our multi-channel approach and get more coordinated. Now, speaking of coordination, as we move to the next slide, this is really inside baseball, but this is probably the thing that I'm most excited about. What you're looking at in the screen in the back here is our new editorial calendar. Last year, when I came to you, we were keeping an editorial calendar based essentially on a Google Calendar, and it was working okay, maybe. We invested in a third-party software product, and now we have people from across the organization that can log in and add their topics. We have it open during team meetings. The critical thing to know, I'm not asking anyone to read what's back there on that screen. That's actually a day-by-day schedule of what we're posting on social media. And the color scheme is your focus areas. So each of your 5 focus areas gets a color, and we now know and plan well into the future now the work we're doing and which of your objectives it's most supporting at any given time. Now, we're able to build marketing campaigns. So what we do now, instead of thinking about, and we're still implementing it, there's exceptions to this, it's not perfect yet, but we are more and more thinking about your agenda and the work that's happening with the city team and the needs of our community and what we're getting for feedback and planning farther out and building campaigns around it. So an example would be every spring, we get a lot of water, a lot of moisture, and the weeds will grow, and we usually have questions about public rights of way and managing that. And so we know that. We put it on a schedule, and now we can remind ourselves and build all of the different tools that we're going to use. We get that scheduled in. We have all the content right there. We can post to our social media accounts right from this tool. So it's very much saving us some effort and time, and it's making us more strategic and more integrated across the organization when we're working on projects. The line here is simply to say from our traditional, our standard flagship Arvada report, all the way through to a daily or hourly post on social media. We're now tracking to make sure that work is attached to your strategic plan directly. Next slide, please. All right, marketing. So again, marketing is really an excellent ad by the council. And I just wanted to talk a little bit, really we've started as a point of departure to focus on city successes. So you can see on the image to the lower left, that's really just a recent screenshot of our news page on our website, just to say that we're trying to build in more of a balance where the things we want our community to know about services and building in a little bit more emphasis on the things we've accomplished that also tie to those services. So we're not just tooting our own horn, we're trying to direct them back to the thing that's useful for them. And each one of those, by the way, got a marketing campaign on our editorial calendar. So that's why you probably saw something about that on Nextdoor, a lot of social media posts, all of our different channels. And then we schedule it well in advance. We also, beginning last year, started to think a little differently and wanted to see if we could take one of our positions, a vacant position with Arvada Media Services that had been dedicated exclusively to editing video, to see if we could change it and try to find someone who would be able to not only help with the video work, but bring in storytelling, work with our city team to help develop more, even more creative stories, and build in graphic design and leverage all of our social media tools. And so we just welcomed Leilani Osmondson, who's a new member of our team. She has a film background, so she's able to do that, but she's also helping think through how to tell our stories differently. So if you saw the recent video, the happy birthday video for the water tower, that was one of the first projects she worked on, and so we're really happy with that. Increased alignment with teams, and the upper image is a silly image, sort of, but it's actually a serious image because we meet every month across the organization, so there's representatives from infrastructure, Rachel's up there, Allison Trembley's up there, folks from Arvada Media Services, to think creatively, 3-6 months out, what's coming up that we can really have fun with? Is there something we can maybe be a little silly about, something that we can still deliver the crucial messages that we want to our residents and customers, but still have it be maybe a little bit more compelling? And so one of the ways we got into a fun mood, it's harder on Zoom, is to have the silly hat contest. But we were actually doing work, Council. We were actually doing work. And then the last thing is just our partnerships with the Resiliency Task Force and AIDA and ORA, the Arvada Economic Development Association, the Arvada Urban Renewal Association. These are such valuable partners in helping us think differently about how we market ourselves. You've seen a lot of great press coverage, for example, of how we're supporting businesses during this troubling time during the pandemic. And that was a result of some active pitching on the part of a consultant. And we're appreciating that, and we're also looking to involve that more in our work moving forward, because that's an important part of getting our story out there. If we go to the next slide, please. These are, I could tell you that we have another 10 minutes on each of these bullet points, and believe me, I could do that. But rather than do that to you, I wanted to just give you a list of some of the other things that we've accomplished over the last 12 months that we're exceedingly proud of. Some of them are the result of great things. Some of them are at the bottom of the list is something that's not so great. But just a brief overview, we're extremely proud and thankful that our community participated in the 2020 census to the extent that it did. We got 83% of our citizens to mail back or respond online. That was 3% better than a decade ago. And that would put us in the top 5, depending on the list you look at, top 5 to 10 cities of our size in the country, certainly a leader in our state. We led that number throughout the entire process.
How much do we beat Lakewood by? So when I talk to Mayor Paul, I can rub it in significantly, right?
I will get you that
Yeah,
information.
get that,
Yeah, I'll
because
be
we
sure to
had a
get
little
you.
friendly wager
Yeah,
coming into
good.
this, yes. So,
We'll get it to you.
thank you.
We're really proud. I work closely with Kelly Hartman, and she's also helping with some of the customer experience work and leading our Ask Arvada work. But that was a great partnership in delivering the 2019 community survey. We're looking forward to continuing to implement that plus additional related surveys. Appreciate Community Economic Development and their economic development survey that's out right now, or may have recently concluded. I think it's still out. That's all part of that broader work we talked about. We're looking forward to a 2021 survey and then implementing that on an annual basis moving forward. We have a couple of issues that are in front of us right now that are wonderful opportunities to grow our ability and capacity to reach our citizens and give them the information they need and involve them in the ways they want. Our infrastructure work system is leading an accessibility project, Access Arvada. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act transition planning. That has a huge infrastructure component, also has a huge communications component, particularly with our website, which I'll come back to in a second. But we're looking forward, and we're pleased with the ability to support that project and look forward to more of that. And then also our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and the work to make Arvada a more welcoming and inclusive place. That is essential to our communications approach as well. And so we appreciate their work. It's informing our work. And then we feel like the communications and engagement work supports what they're doing through community meetings and the like. So it's really exciting. And then our customer experience philosophy, I mentioned that's Kelly Hartman and I working with a team from across the organization to develop a strategy that will give us a playbook moving forward, regardless of the interaction, give us more consistent customer service. And that's going to apply to the Ask Arvada rollout. It applies to a website and a host of other communications things. I'm going to just say that we're proud of our COVID-19 response. It's been an incredibly challenging time. We've learned a lot from that, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what we've accomplished as we move to some of the results. Bruce, you can go forward one and then another slide. This is just to illustrate, that previous slide was just to illustrate that we have performance measures we're growing and developing within our ClearPoint, and that we're able to track a host of different metrics. But on the next slide, a graphic that describes some of the ways we've connected with our community and helped them connect with each other during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's hopefully easy to consume. I just really wanted to give a shout out to our print shop team, Steve and Boone, who developed more than 600 signs, including signs in this room and all over this building and other city facilities in a very short amount of time. Proud of the ability to produce these things in-house and efficiently and at a premium, or at a discount. And then obviously really trying to leverage our digital to bridge that in-person, the lack of in-person interaction. At the same time, we've started an engagement. It's not on here, but we started an engagement hotline so people can call 898-7654 and get a weekly update of the engagement opportunities and ways to get involved if they don't have digital access. Next slide, please. Speaking of digital access, though, it's such an important part of what we're doing. Again, these are indications that we're on the right track. If this was a victory, I'd have balloons up on the ceiling and we would have announced it and balloons would have come down, there would have been a band, but this is not success. This is a path towards success. And so we think that seeing a 10% increase in our page views on arvada.org, seeing almost 12% increase in the people using our website, reaching more eyeballs on Twitter, engaging more clicks, more click-throughs on Facebook, people spending 15.5% more time with our videos. We think that those are signs that our coordination and integrated effort and the teamwork across the organization is working. And then I threw on Arvada News because I'm frankly just super proud of that. Cindy Javelet and the city manager's office puts that together every other week. We have now 4,700 people subscribe to that across our community. And we have an open rate of 51%. We know that about half of those people are opening and getting that information every other week. That's incredibly powerful, and it outperforms industry standards by some, depending on how you do it, 25 to 30%. Next slide, please. Okay, speak up, I mentioned it. Hugely important, particularly now, in getting input from our community on a range of different topics. We're proud of what we've done so far. In the last year, we're now at 2,000 registered Arvadans who come to the site and offer input on different projects. We've had 14 active projects in the last 12 months, almost 8,000 visits, and we added 335 people, Arvadans, to that 2,000 to bring us to 2,000 participants. We're about 2 years into the implementation of this. The graphic to the right, that's where I want to just say, you know, it's cause for a little bit of caution. We know we have to redouble our efforts and focus even more on this important asset. Because what you see in comparison to 2018, October 2018 to September 2019 on the left-hand, or the middle column on that right graphic, is compared to the same numbers for 2019 and 2020. And this is really a demonstration of our methodology, particularly with Speak Up, but generally for all of our engagement, is we're seeking to make a lot of people aware, some subset of those folks informed about what's going on, and then hopefully we're getting a fair chunk of those folks below that to engage and do something. Click on the link, offer the feedback, attend the meeting. And here what we're seeing with this online platform is that our engagement and people who are informed about what we're doing is going down. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is we launched it, a lot of different projects, maybe 19 or 20 projects in the previous year in relation to the City Council Visioning Project at the end of 2018. But the other thing is just we would not expect, given that, a 50% decrease in our informed and engaged users. So that tells us we want to focus on that in the next year. We want to carry our engagement cycle all the way through to grabbing the feedback, telling people what the feedback was, and how it's been used in the projects moving forward. And we do that a lot of the time. We don't do that all the time. So we want to make that better.
Mr. Pfeiffer.
Yeah, you know, one area I would encourage, and I was thinking you just did this the other day, I was looking through my deleted folders, was announcing the surveys. It doesn't seem like they come out too often, at least for me, I don't see them. So I thought I saw one that within the last week or two that said, hey, we'd like you to come back and look at something again and give your opinion. How frequently do we do that? That was the first time I recall seeing one. Is that because I think you forget what's up there if you don't go and visit it all the time or see it on social media?
Yeah, it's a good point. I would say that we always announce something new, but we do so not always in a consistent way. So one of the things we could do is anytime we add a new project to Speak Up, we should be sending a newsletter to those 2,000 people saying, thanks for all your participation before. Please try, please offer your input if it applies to you to this new project. Quite honestly, we don't always get that done, and that's something that we're going to keep working on and review and make more of a process.
I think you'll get more engagement if you get people to come back. The only reason I remember to go look at something is because I got a notice to say, hey, you should go look.
Yeah.
So,
and you're gonna see an improvement there for sure. Okay, so next slide, we're hopefully rounding the home stretch here a little bit, is the community survey, the 2019 community survey. Now you've already received this presentation, and you know that we're not declaring victory on anything. This is a sign that maybe we're headed in the right direction. Of the 5 measures from that survey, those survey results that were statistically significantly improved, 3 of those had to do with transparency, community engagement. In essence, each of those bullet points are showing that people feel like their expectations are more met now than they were 2 years earlier around being able to find the information they need about city work, being included in city decisions, and so on. So those are good signs. We take the improvement for sure. We also don't believe that a 6, it's not this apples to apples, but forgive me, a 6 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10 doesn't really meet what we're shooting for. And we know that we have peer cities that are performing better, so we're going to keep working. So Bruce, let's move to next steps. You can just buzz past this one. All right. Just wanted to remind you of what we said our opportunities and next steps were a year ago, and it should look familiar. We're going to touch on some of this again. So if we go to the next slide, I want to do a deep dive on a couple of those. One was improving engagement coordination. You can tell, hopefully we've conveyed that we have made some improvement in how we're coordinating our engagement, but we also know and are appreciative of the fact that Council approved the 2021 budget, 2021-2022 budget that included a position to really focus on coordinating engagement. And that's where you're going to see even more, not just with the position, because we're going to be doing some more training and more frequent core team meetings around this, but we're hoping to get some support in implementing Speak Up more consistently. We're also looking forward to using the position to help train and instill more of our city team in the best practices around community involvement, particularly online, but also for in-person, because I hope soon that we are able to return to an in-person engagement place to a greater degree. And then just grow the engagement on Speak Up, and also explore our use of things like community connectors, to have someone that's able to actively recruit members of our community to participate in the Community Connector program, which made a huge difference for the 2020 census success. Next slide, please. I want to talk about Arvada.org. I mentioned it last year. It's been a part of our budget presentations. It's time for us to replace Arvada.org. It hasn't been meaningfully updated in more than 5 years. It's an in-house, homegrown solution that really was great when we had it, first had it, and now it's not able to incorporate the third-party services. It doesn't display video the way that our users are expecting, and so it is very difficult to manage from a content perspective. It's also difficult to keep everything fully accessible. There are some things in the ADA transition plan we won't be able to accomplish until we update our website. So that's why it's on our radar. And then finally, it's technically challenging to update from a variety of perspectives. You're going to hear from IT Director Craig Poley in the coming weeks or so, and he's got a number of things to share about IT work. But I know that he's going to mention that challenge as part of his discussion with you.
Mr. Pfeiffer.
So this brings up a question that I think a lot of organizations struggle with, is not necessarily that we need an app to engage our, you're talking about your engagement through social media and some others, and some folks don't necessarily engage through social media. In fact, there's even discussions that they could decline over time, especially depending on how the environments are. Sure. But you don't want to lose that engagement. So not necessarily apps are the right thing. They're talking more of mobile-friendly websites that act like apps.
Yep.
I think the big thing that I want to make sure we keep in mind is some folks like being notified by an app. Some folks rather be engaged that way versus texting. So when you go down this path, I guess you've been here a long time when you see the website turn 2 or 3 times over, because I felt like we just put this one up, that we're thinking about that. That has to be solved somewhere in here. Yeah. I don't know what the right answer is, but we need to make sure, I think it's like, 78-80% of people are actually going to websites through mobile devices. Yeah. So they need to be really mobile friendly and make sure that we're going down that way. 100%. And I also think that I won't get into it, but the smart city stuff ties into that as well. So hopefully there's some collaboration between the smart cities, the revamp of the website, how do you make it mobile friendly, how do we share data, how do we share information.
Yeah.
And add to that kiosks and holograms.
Dots hologram.
Yeah. It's all feasible. We're focusing on arvada.org first.
Yeah.
To your point,
Holograms last. It's probably
I will say
2050.
we did.
It would be so small, I'd barely see you.
We definitely we took a step forward with kiosks a little bit with census, and then the pandemic hit, and nobody wanted to touch anything. So
Can you do hand motions? Just
but
do hand motions.
speaking of changing our perspective and focus a little bit, I mean, what we did in early on in 2019, I want to say we formed a core team, right? A group of folks from our IT department, and then representatives from all of our work systems that work in outreach communication to help develop the content and the technical strategies to support our website. And the first thing that everybody said, I was brand new then in January of 2019 or shortly thereafter. Everybody said, we got to have a new website, and what we wondered was maybe it's functioning okay for now, because it's fairly well organized, it's clear, it's written in a more of a user perspective than other websites I'd seen. And we decided to focus on Inside Arvada. And so we did that. And then we really thought we should focus on Ask Arvada and updating that, because we really think that will move the needle with our customer experience. And so Kelly Hartman's leading that project. And now we're ready to focus on arvada.org. The point I want to make with all of that is all those same people, for Craig Foley's team and a number of individuals in IT, folks, the same folks you saw in some of the screenshots of meetings, as well as other people that aren't there, they're all participating in providing input on a lot of these different projects. And and I know that the Arvada.org is a part of the smart city thinking. It's definitely a part of our customer experience philosophy. There's an entire group just focused on ensuring that the customer experience on the website is going to improve over time. So I think it's inclusive.
Yeah, and I would just stress that it needs to be a one-stop shop, because I work, I go into Ask Arvada, so that's one app, and then you want something else, I go to the website. If I want something else, I go somewhere else. And if we can hopefully bring that all together into one-stop shop, I think you'll get better engagement.
Yeah. We're in an acquisition phase for Ask Arvada right now, and we have the opportunity to see a lot of products out there, and almost all of them feature that type of functionality and choice for our user. If they want to go to that interface, they can do it on their web, and it'll be extremely responsive on their mobile device. They can use an app, or they can go online. And what's exciting is we're going to, I don't know, I couldn't tell you which solution we're going with yet, but I can say that depending on the solution, we do have the ability to integrate our phone system. We have the ability to sort of bring people who may not have digital access into that customer experience management system. So I agree. Basically, I see it as an extension too of meeting people where they're at, and that applies in digital as well, where you need to provide different ways of accessing it and one-stop shops. Yeah.
Good.
And holograms. I think there's exciting things with goggles and VR and stuff. I haven't given up. All right, if we could go to the next slide quickly, Bruce. All right. So the
Move
official
along before council gets crazy.
the official next steps. We talked about the first two. We're super excited to launch Ask Arvada in the coming year under Kelly's and Craig's leadership. We're going to continue our support of making our information and our engagement opportunities accessible for everyone, and supporting the city's work to make all of the city accessible. Our work to make the city more inclusive and welcoming in how we communicate and ask for input. We're going to keep working on that. And then finally, we're going to complete our marketing plan, which will involve a lot of collaboration with our community, our partners, so that we can create a messaging platform and a set of messages and ways of talking about our work that works for our organization, but also furthers the goals of all of our partners that we rely on. Even now, to a great, I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied, but it's no more clear than right now that we need those partnerships and we need to be collaborating more. So I think with that, that's the end of the presentation. It went a little longer than I'd hoped, but we've left you with a couple of questions, and I appreciate again the opportunity to be here. Bruce, if you could go to the next slide, please. Your time tonight, the attention of the community to go through our implementation of the strategy. Appreciate any feedback and other questions that you might have.
Ms. Miller's ready.
Thank you, sir. That was a fantastic presentation. I appreciate you. Appreciate all the work that everybody has done. It is really great. Just any feedback on some things I'd like to see as you're thinking about all of this is I'd love to see video on websites as you go onto a website, a welcome from the city manager or the mayor or something. Here's how to get through this site, a little tutorial. And then, on city pages, people talking and interacting. I think that's a great way to tie back from social media, tie back from all of the different things to the website, to videos. I think it's cool. Cool what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Jones?
One thing that, well, first of all, great update, and I appreciate the work that's been done. But one of the things that comes to mind that we continually get feedback about, and it has nothing to do with this, it has to do with the community involvement in a project, and how can we do a better job of, and that may not be part of your little charter here in this communication effort, but I think something that we need to take into consideration of, getting the feedback from the community and getting feedback on projects and those kinds of things, so that when we have a public hearing and the community is given input and feedback, that we've got access to that as well.
I would just respond to that by saying I think that there's a lot we could do to improve it. I think one piece, certainly not the whole thing, is, and this is a thing that actually our leadership team is piloting under leadership of Vanessa Janes and Noelle Oberg, a decision-making process. And when we're doing community engagement, public involvement, it's important when you apply that spectrum I showed to know where you are in the decision-making process. And I think that people will find they may not be happy always with the decision or the direction of a project, but if we follow that decision-making process and we're really clear with people, we're going to ask for your opinion or input about this thing. Here's where we are. This decision's been made, but we still need help on this decision. When we clarify that, people's expectations hopefully are more aligned and they feel more satisfied with the process.
And I think that's key, and I appreciate you saying that, because that's, again, those expectations. And why are you seeking input from me when it doesn't feel like I'm being heard or listened to? So I appreciate the fact that you're modeling that right now.
Pretty good, Mr. Fiber.
Yeah, and to even further that conversation, I don't know, now that I worry about how long time goes, it seems like it was yesterday, but it could have been 5-10 years ago, all I know. But at one point, I remember we had this thought where all the council would have to be here. Anyone who testified had to be physically here. And we really were catapulted into a new era, which I was excited for, just the remoteness and the engagement. And I've gotten so much positive feedback that we still do these hybrid meetings where we're all here, but we allow the community to engage remotely. And I think that truly harnesses inclusiveness. Because if you have disabilities or you can't get there or it's weather, people can still feel like they're engaged and heard. But what I would ask the team to do is elevate that to the next level. I know there's cities, and I was watching the ones in Arizona that had several online engagement during a city council meeting. Now, granted, I'm not sure it all fit for us, but speaking of why, we do stuff remote, and I'm sure we'll hear a dog soon or Amazon delivering something.
Sure.
But
It's a part of it now.
yeah, it is. It's part of the new norm.
Yeah.
But what I would like to see is where people feel like they can, at home, when they're not just engaged by watching these screens, they're actually engaged by seeing the agenda, being engaged like they can chat into there, or there's live community, chatting back, or, there needs to be some validation that they are citizens still. But I'd like to elevate that hybrid approach to the next level, because I feel, and maybe the council feels differently, but I don't know if this will we'll get rid of this. I think that this is something that is the new norm, and I think if we really genuinely believe that we want as much people engaged into the process, we have to keep harnessing this and still engage it and just keep elevating it. And so when you ask for the near-term strategies, I would throw one in here right now. This is a good time where trial by fire, you all rocked it out of the park with throwing all these things up and stuff, but I think you can start moving towards maybe a permanent solution now and taking it to the next level and tie it into your community engagement. So
Absolutely.
yeah, good job.
Yeah, Ben, I want to congratulate you for your obvious enthusiasm. Great presentation, good information. I feel like we're moving in the right direction, so thank you.
Thank you all. Good evening.
Very good. Ms. Gillis, we have one other one.
Yes, our next topic coming up will be on the housing strategy. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an update on the Housing Strategy Advisory Committee's work related to the City Council strategic result to improve access to quality housing that is affordable for a broad range of income levels. The City of Arvada hired Root Policy Research to conduct an assessment of the current characteristics and housing needs in the community. On October 28, 2019, City Council workshop, Root Policy Research provided an update of the status of housing assessment at the time and gathered feedback from City Council. Root Policy Research has since completed their housing assessment and is here this evening to provide an overview of the outcome of their research and to also provide recommendations for effective tools that may be used to preserve and produce affordable housing in Arvada. Here to present to us tonight is Molly Fitzpatrick, Managing Director at Root Policy Research, to walk us through the results of the assessment.
Hi everyone, thank you for letting me join you virtually tonight. So hopefully you can hear me okay, and we'll just walk through the presentation.
Can we get the volume turned down just a little bit?
How's that? Is that better? I'll keep talking until you
Yes,
get your
that's good.
volume
That's good.
adjusted, or I can just try to speak more quietly.
You're good.
We'll see how we do.
You're
Great,
good.
perfect. Well, thank you again. I for one appreciate your adaptation to COVID and allowing me to present virtually. So thanks for that. I know it's not ideal, but I appreciate the opportunity. So I was before you about a year ago presenting some preliminary results. We then kind of moved into the strategy component of the study and worked with city staff to really present and craft strategies and recommendations that really help address the needs that we identified in a way that we think and the staff believes is really the right path forward for Arvada. So I'll just jump in and we're going to walk through kind of what we identified as the top needs and then those strategies, and happy to answer any questions you might have as well. Of course, there's plenty more detail in the actual report, perhaps more than you might even want. So we'll just hit the high points tonight and I'll kind of walk us through. So Bruce, thanks for managing slides. You can go ahead and jump to the next one. And I'll just start really by kind of reminding you all why did we do this and what does it matter, which I'm sure you know. But obviously, having a balanced housing stock really accommodates kind of what we call a full life cycle community. And so really thinking about housing options for each stage of life, each different phase, really in turn supports the local economy because it really accommodates kind of this full continuum, both of residents and housing types. The City of Arvada, through other efforts as well, comprehensive planning, and through the zoning update, has really acknowledged the need for diversity in terms of housing and what that actually brings to the community, both from a cultural standpoint, but also really from an economic development standpoint. And so that's really the framework from which we operate and which we start to think about housing needs in the community. This continuum graphic is certainly not comprehensive of all household types or all housing types, but it gives you a sense of kind of the intricate web of housing solutions and housing needs across different income levels, and really sort of epitomizes kind of the full spectrum of housing that's needed really in any community. And then we'll talk about specific types within Arvada that kind of rose to the top in terms of housing needs. So broadly speaking, we've seen recent trends in market prices that are going up. That may be pushing Arvada a little bit out of reach for those middle income households. And so really, our goal here is to think about where are the acute needs in the market, and then what policy or market incentives might you be able to implement as a city government that can really help move Arvada in the direction that you've already said you wanted to go, and really start addressing those needs, but really keep the path of the city along what it has charted as its path forward. So go ahead and jump to the next slide, Bruce, and again, the next one. And this is just a quick summary of these top housing needs. And in the slides that follow, I'll talk you through a couple of the data points that support these. There's obviously a lot more analysis in the report as well, but we'll talk through some of the top issues and top findings. So the first need that was identified is just additional affordable rentals or rental assistance, specifically for renters earning less than $35,000. So that's really the price break where the market stops serving well the residents that have incomes below that amount. The second need was starter homes and family homes priced near or below $300,000. We'll talk about some of the data that goes into that. And then third, increased diversity in housing stock with a focus on missing middle ownership options and product types that are attractive both to aging seniors, but also millennials who tend to have similar tastes, surprisingly sometimes, in housing stock. So go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll kind of talk through a little bit more of the data behind some of these recommendations. So on the additional affordable rentals, rents in Arvada have been rising a lot faster than income, so renters are having trouble keeping up. So between 2010 and 2017, rent increased by about 34%, and median income rose by 15%. So just not quite keeping up. That's common in the metro area, really among a lot of communities, but certainly a challenge for renters in Arvada. The biggest shifts, as you can see illustrated here in this bar chart, which shows the rental distribution in 2010 in gray bars and then 2017 in red, you can really see a loss of market rate units that were priced below $800. And really looking at all those red lines that sort of moved up and jumped into higher price categories, that's really the price point where we saw a big shift. Is in those rental units that were priced below $800, specifically between $500 and $800 per month. So really losing a lot of market rate affordability in the market over the past decade.
Let me stop you there for a question by Mr. Marriott.
Molly, thank you. Let me just ask you a quick question. On this graph that you show with the comparison to 2010, are those numbers adjusted for inflation, or are those just raw numbers?
They are raw numbers, so they are showing 2010 dollars for the 2010 figures and then 2017 dollars. So we would expect to see some shift upward in terms of inflation, but typically, if it's just inflation driving those, you see sort of incremental shifts across the distribution as opposed to kind of the swing that we're seeing from those really tall bars in the gray to kind of jumping up a couple of categories. But good question. Those are nominal values.
Okay, just one quick question for you. In that 7-year time period that you're measuring here, do you have any idea what you'd be talking about for inflation? An inflation figure, is that a 20% figure or a 25% figure?
No, and really, it's a little bit, inflation is tricky because inflation adjusts for housing, and so typically in housing prices it gets a little bit confusing. So that's why we typically compare it just to incomes. And so instead of thinking about kind of inflation, if we look at incomes went up by 15% over that period, whereas rents were going up by about 34%. And so the inflation would have been, I'd have to look it up exactly, but it's probably closer to that 15, right, which tracks where incomes were going in Arvada at the time.
Okay, so based on that metric, though, if you were to produce this chart kind of indexed to wages as opposed to inflation, but indexed to wages, it would account for about half of the change on this chart. Is that correct?
Overall, like sort of at the median, it accounts for about half of that change. It's a little bit more complicated to look at it in each bar necessarily because not everything shifts kind of at the same rate. So we saw a bigger jump in terms of the shift between those units that were priced around $650 to $800. Those were the ones that really jumped up a good bit more, and so not all the shifts were uniform. So I'd say, yeah, at the median, you could say that inflation accounted for about half. That's not necessarily true in every category. You could also, most of that income shift, was not necessarily felt by the lowest wage workers. And so it just sort of depends on kind of who exactly we're talking about and what types of housing. But yeah, on average, you could say it accounted for maybe half.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And then Bruce, go ahead to the next slide. And here, just kind of some additional analysis around looking at kind of the income distribution and the price point. We do what's called a gaps analysis. And basically that finds that the private rental market in Arvada is largely serving renters that are earning between $35,000 and $75,000, but really primarily serving those that are kind of on the $30,000 to $50,000 range. So really that tells us the market's failing to serve those renters that earn less than $25,000. It's sort of struggling to serve those that are earning between $25,000 and $35,000. So those are some of the key breakpoints that we think about in terms of rental needs. So about 27% of renters overall earn less than $25,000 in Arvada. And the bar chart at the bottom of this slide kind of brings to life a little bit more characteristic about who those households are. So who are those renters earning less than $25,000? And these categories are not exclusive, so you could be one household that appears in multiple of these categories, but it gives you a sense of kind of who those households might be. About 41% have at least one person that has a disability living in that household. About 28% have at least one senior in that household, and 25% have children in the household. Most of those households, about 2/3, are single people living alone, which is one indicator of why their income is fairly low. So those are low-wage workers or folks on, either SSI or SSDI that are living alone. But most of those are 30 and older. So a very small proportion are kind of young adults living alone that fall into that category. About half of that category of folks living alone is age 30 to 65, and then another chunk there is are seniors that are living alone. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Bruce. I also would like to point out these are results from the community survey. That there was the 2019 community survey, and one of the questions, or a couple of questions, really asked about residents' appetite for programs and investment that help ensure low-wage workers and middle-wage workers who are working in Arvada can actually live there. And there's really strong support both for those types of programs that help people live in the communities that they work in, as well as programs that would help mitigate risk of homelessness. So strong community support for wanting to address some of these needs that we're talking about, particularly on the rental side, because this is really kind of the need or the programs that would address those low-wage workers as well as people at risk of homelessness. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And we'll start talking here about our second recommendation, or our second need that was identified, which is starter homes and family homes, priced near or below $300,000. I think you've seen this chart before. It's one of the ones that we presented last time as well. So it just really shows the steep escalation in the median home price in the metro overall. Arvada there is in the red line, and you can see some comparison communities around. Lots of increase in all of these communities. But really acknowledging that housing prices have gone up fairly dramatically. We've also had really low interest rates, which is great, but those low interest rates and incomes that are increasing slightly has not been enough to really keep pace with that. Arvada also tends to have fewer homes that are in that entry-level price point below $350,000 than the metro overall. So about 1/3 of homes in the metro are priced below $350,000. In Arvada, it's about 1 in 5 homes.
Mr. Marriott's got a question.
Sure.
Let me ask you another question, Molly. Thanks for taking my questions along as you go.
Of course, happy to do that, for sure.
The question I have is, one of these strategies is needs to be more starter homes and family homes priced near or below $300,000. Do you have any idea what builders are able to deliver to the market new homes for at a minimum? Like, who's selling the cheapest homes new in Arvada now, and what are they priced at?
Right. Well, that's a great question. I don't know that I can speak to specific builders that are in process of development and where their price points are. But I will say that there certainly are builders in the metro that are hitting these price points, but it does tend to be in attached products. And so that's one other key point, I think, is that really those attached units, missing middle units, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, townhomes, duplex, triplex, those types of products, or even small lot homes can carry more affordability. So when we actually look at what was listed on the market in 2019 when we were doing this study, about 75% of those attached products were priced below $350,000. So not quite hitting that $300,000 target, but a pretty good chunk. They just represented a really small share of the Arvada for sale product. And so I think, some of that, you've obviously gone through a zoning update as well and increased some of the flexibility around where those types of things can get built and how that works. But it does really depend not just on construction prices, but also kind of on what can get built, what the market is asking for, but also what the city is allowing in certain areas. So it's a little bit of a non-answer, other than you're right to assume it is really challenging to hit that price point. In new construction, we don't see it often, and that's partly because a lot of fees and zoning regs tend to incentivize larger development. And so doing some of the work that you've already done around zoning updates and freeing up the market to be able to create some of that does help unlock some of that affordable potential.
So the reason I asked the question is my understanding, or in my looking around, I haven't seen, whether it's downtown or in other suburbs on the west side of town or even on the east side of town, I don't think I've seen anything new sold for less than $300,000 unless it's something that's unique or unless it's subsidized is the only way that it gets to be below 300,000. So that leaves you then with the existing inventory on the market, that's how you can get to that price point. But how in the world does a city influence what somebody can sell their existing house for? It seems like
Right.
that's a market set price, not necessarily a city set price, and that the cost of that house are already baked in. And there doesn't seem like the city has anything they can do with an existing owned product.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And this, obviously, the city can't say, to that existing homeowner, you have to sell it for this amount. But what the city can do is create housing that would increase churn in the market. And so a lot of what we heard, even through some of the community engagement that we did as part of this project, was from folks that have been in their home for quite a while, many kind of aging seniors that said, yeah, I'd like to live in a different type of home. I live, in maybe a 50s ranch or an older home. I want to downsize my yard. I want to downsize my house. I want to live in like a patio home that's maybe got a little bit of flexibility for me, but that doesn't exist. And so essentially you're locking up some of that inventory that would be naturally more affordable, some of those older homes, particularly some of the older, smaller homes. And so without providing the housing or allowing for the housing to be developed that those folks want to move into, you end up kind of locking up and stagnating the market a bit. So it's not that we're saying you should price control every house. It's that you should create enough option that you increase churn in the market, which can be good for unlocking some of those places, particularly when people are mismatched with their preferences. And that's what we heard to some extent. That's not everybody, of course, but there are certainly people that feel kind of mismatched in what they want versus what they can access.
Thank you.
Sure. And then let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
Ms. Ford's got a question before you move on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Molly, and that brings up something that I've been thinking about, because when I look at your price points of, the average rent being $1,584 with an income of $64,000, when I look at those figures, that may be, and I don't know, I didn't test if that was 30% of $64,000, the $1,584. But just based on my own personal, finances, if my household income was $64,000, for me, there's no way in the world that I would pay $1,584 in rent, because it really doesn't afford a lot of extra money to spend. You're just putting all your money in your home, your housing costs, but if you want to have a little fun in life, there's not much extra with that. So that's what I struggle with, because even the 30% is, in my opinion, and I'm very conservative fiscally, is very high.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think it is a stretch for a lot of folks, and that's based on a 30% assumption. But there are also, there's some arguments that say we should be assuming less in terms of how much people can spend on housing, partly because of an increase in transportation costs nationwide, as well as, healthcare, debt, those types of things as well. So we're basing all of our affordability numbers on that 30%, but you're right, that can actually be quite a stretch for people, particularly for people in lower incomes where all of the rest of their disposable income is going toward necessities. So jumping back in a bit, this next slide is showing you the price distribution of homes in Arvada compared to the metros. You can see where Arvada is a bit higher. It's not necessarily an inherent problem, but it's just an acknowledgement of kind of how that compares to the metro overall. We did a gaps analysis as well for sale market as we did for the rental. So really showing, there's some affordability for renters that are earning at least $75,000, but really you don't start to hit some decent options in the market until you're earning about $100,000 as a household based on current interest rates. focus group participants that we talked with, both residents and stakeholders, really talked about the need for entry-level ownership options, and were concerned about barriers to entry for renters moving into ownership, but also barriers in the inventory. So a little bit about what I talked about in terms of churn, making sure that there is the right kinds of products are being developed, and that actually helps kind of improve the health of the overall market. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And that will move us into a discussion which is very related, but it's talking about increased diversity. So, you know, the second need is really focused on that price point, but one of the ways to get to that price point is talking about housing diversity. But we don't just talk about housing diversity for the sake of price point. Really find that there are, you know, there's preferences along different types of housing. And so we're kind of looking at this from both those perspectives in a way that it might be able to unlock affordability, but also that it might meet the needs and the preferences of residents that are already in Arvada. So when we compare Arvada to other surrounding communities, you know, Arvada has relatively low diversity in terms of product, particularly in the ownership market. So fairly similar to Broomfield, as you can see in that top graphic, but basically less diversity, so primarily single family compared to Lakewood, Thornton, and Westminster, all of which are majority single family developments or communities, but they just have a little bit more on the options when we look at some of those other structure types. And that's actually, in terms of development, a little bit of a newer phenomenon. The graphic at the bottom there is showing you permit trends by the number of units in the structure really over the past, I think, 20 years. We go back to the early 90s there. And the blue and the black bars, which are kind of in the middle, are showing you products that are either 3 or 4 unit structures or 2 unit structures. So duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, all of those are in that blue and black. You can see that there were actually more of those types of products developed in the 90s and even through the 2000s than there has been in the recovery since the most recent recession. So of course, housing development in general dropped pretty dramatically during the recession. It has really picked back up in recent years, but it's primarily been single family. And so acknowledging that has been a part of your housing kind of development in the past, and it's been slightly more limited in recent years.
Molly, isn't part of that because of the construction defect litigations, and we're starting to see some improvement? I know that we in Arvada and other municipalities have worked hard to sort of level the playing field with, you know, we've done a plat note provision here in Arvada that I think has encouraged some more townhome type of construction, and we're starting to see more of that kind of housing coming online here in Arvada.
Yep, absolutely. I think you're right. You know, construction defects really technically applies to larger developments, the larger units in structure, but developers get really gun shy about developing anything that's attached because of their concern around litigation related to construction defects. And so certainly that's something that we're kind of waiting to see the market respond to as more and more communities are really working hard to address that concern with developers. And so certainly I think that's playing a role. I think, you know, coming out of a recession, developers also tend to go with kind of a luxury product, oftentimes is what we'll see coming out of a recession. So developers still a little bit kind of nervous about the market, thinking, well, I'm going to shoot high and shoot for a high margin product if I can in that wake. And so I do think that some of that is based on economic cycle, but just being aware of it is useful as you think about, you know, as you say, ways to help facilitate that kind of development or make sure that that's an option based on market incentives. Great point. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And the graphic you see here is just kind of an illustration of that missing middle, which we talk about, and really just acknowledging that they do have a smaller footprint, and they, both in terms of the house product, but also in terms of lots, and so that can help meet the needs, both of affordability needs of first-time buyers, but also preferences specifically of the aging population. Often there's a desire among the aging population to age in one's own home, but to do that by downsizing, reducing some maintenance, potentially going to single level living, some of those things as well. Not all seniors are going to want to downsize, so we do want to acknowledge that. So there will also be some need just for modifications, accessibility repairs. You know, the city does a good job of funding some of that and running programs for that, particularly with CDBG dollars as well. But that will continue to be a need. We certainly don't expect all seniors to up and move as part of that. We're just seeing an increase in some of those preferences. So there's more diverse product choices, typically supply units that are demanded by changing preferences. You know, we've talked about that among seniors. We also see changing preferences among higher income renters that want to transition into ownership, but maybe aren't ready to leave a more kind of urban-esque lifestyle. So thinking about some of those ownership product types in Old Town and around there, where there's still some walkability, some you know, sort of nightlife style attraction for millennials. It also helps you retain young adults that may have moved there for you know, light rail access or culture, but then want to transition into ownership and start looking at where can they do that, and can they do that in Arvada? Are you kind of retaining a good economic development driver in that population by giving them options that meet their preferences? Let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
Yes, Ms. Ford, sorry.
Sure.
I just want to say one thing. I don't know who developed my complex, but I think that whoever developed my complex had a wonderful idea, because in my complex, it's a condominium complex, and it, you know, it has, there's 356 units, I believe, 52 buildings, and each building has 5 units, and not all of them are the same, but most of them are such that on the edge were single-story condominiums, and I find that a lot of older people are living in those. Not all, some are rented, and then you have, you know, one unit where it's a studio where people go upstairs and it's single level, and then you have 2 units that are similar to a townhome where you have the first floor and the second floor, and they're all different sizes. And what I find about my community is you just see a real diverse group of people. You know, you have very young people, you have people renting, you have people owning, you have older, you know, the older folks that can stay there forever and ever, and it's in that, you know, affordable range where it did double since I've been here, absolutely doubled in price, but it's in that 300 range. And it's, if we could get more housing stock like that, where the buildings are, you know, they provide a lot of varied housing within it. I think that it's just a fantastic design.
Great, and I'll just kind of spring off of that to talk about kind of what perceptions were that we heard from residents. As part of that community survey, one of the questions we asked was, you know, what do you think about these different housing types and whether or not they're appropriate in your neighborhood? And like you were saying, there's a lot of appetite for that type of product among our Arvada residents. So very open to what we would call soft density, duplexes, townhomes, and that sort of thing in their neighborhoods, in the neighborhoods in which people are currently living. And so, you know, this graphic kind of shows preferences around product types in one's neighborhood, somewhere else in Arvada or not in Arvada. It kind of gives you a spectrum along what people think is appropriate. But, you know, so often we hear that, you know, there's community resistance, and while that's true to some extent, certainly our Arvada residents are saying, no, we like that product diversity when we feel like it fits in the context of our neighborhoods.
Mr. Marriott.
Thank you. Molly, I had a question exactly about this particular slide, and that is, without comparison or benchmarking compared to other communities, this slide doesn't tell me much. So, you know, when you talk about asking people the question, would you be okay if somebody built duplexes in your neighborhood? What do they say in other places? You know, how would Arvada compare to Denver or Golden or Thornton or Greenwood Village? Are we about the same as them? Are we more resistant? Are we less resistant? How would you benchmark this versus other times you've asked this question in other places?
Yeah, great question. And I would say We have asked this question. I have to go back and look. I know we've asked it in a couple other Denver suburban communities. I don't think we've ever asked it in the city of Denver. But I can actually pull some of those data and take a look and see where you benchmark. I mean, my gut feel is that typically when we ask this question, your community appears to be a little bit more open to duplex and townhomes in their own neighborhood. And so I would expect those to be, you know, typically probably closer to 35 to 40%, whereas you're sort of 45 and 50% on those two metrics. And I'm working a little bit off of gut feel, and we work in a lot of different types of communities. But I'd say that to me is pretty strong openness to those product types. Not super open, obviously, to apartments at 4+ stories. That's really a wild card one, but not surprised to see that one pretty low. But apartment buildings 1 to 3 stories, 24% is pretty good as well. And so I think I would say your community appears to be pretty open to that type of soft density relative to what we often see. But that may be because, you know, you've done a great job as a city to say, you know, there are places in the community where we want to have you've developed such a great sort of city center area with Old Town, and so I think you've kind of captured the ethic there in terms of what the community might want, and so I think folks have seen some of the benefit of that. But that to say, we could go back and look and see where we've done this survey before and see if we've got some comparison data for you.
Thank you.
Ms. Ford?
Sure. And with that, why don't we go ahead and move
Whoa,
to
whoa,
the next?
no, hold on.
I'm sorry.
Ms. Ford's got a question.
Sure.
Actually, Molly, I have a question and a statement. What would make this chart more helpful for me is who the people are that are responding and how many numbers were in this survey. So in other words, I would want to know that for the, you know, because I've heard from a lot of constituents that they don't want high buildings, okay? So when I saw the 50%, it didn't surprise me. It actually confirmed what I was thinking. However, I still would want to know where are those people currently living that said what they said, because that has relevance for what they're saying they want and what they don't want. You know, all 12%, were they people that were currently living in apartments that were, you know, versus, you know, because my gut feeling is, you know, we're a community of mostly single-family homes. So that, you know.
Yep, and so this was based on the 2019 community survey. So this is based on a broad spectrum of residents. However, in the actual report, we break this exact graphic out by residents overall, which is what you see here, but also by renters, people that are currently renting, people that are currently owning, and we also break it out by income level, I believe, and we may break it out by minority status as well, people of color. I'd have to double check that one. I don't think we have, you know, like zip code or geography to that level of detail, but we do break that out, and you're absolutely right that people that are currently living in rental units are much more likely than people that are in owner-occupied units to say, I think my apartments make sense, because they're living in one. So obviously it makes sense in their neighborhood. So you're absolutely right to point that out. All of that nuance is captured in the report.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So with that, let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. We'll dive into some of the recommended strategies on how to address some of these needs, and you can even go ahead and advance to the next one. I know you can't read this. This is really just to illustrate that in the full report, there is a matrix of the strategies that gives you a lot more detail than what we're going to go into tonight. Tonight, I just want to give you kind of the overview of the strategies. But in the report, there's a matrix that talks about each strategy. It gives you a description. It talks about which people are typically served or what types of households are typically served, the pros and cons of each strategy, as well as you know, some of the keys to success and the right market conditions for when a strategy is most effective, and then also talks about whether or not we perceive this in terms of kind of our perspective and staff's perspective around whether it's kind of a short-term strategy or a longer-term strategy. So we won't dwell on this, but I just want you to know there's a lot more detail, there's more nuance in the report that really gives you kind of a deeper dive on each of these strategies. So that matrix is kind of a worthwhile look as you go through the full report. But for now, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll just walk through the 6 strategies that Root Policy is recommending, but that's in conjunction with our discussions with staff. We started with kind of a whole toolkit of about 15 different strategies that we said, hey, these are all the strategies we think might work, but we want to talk about how to calibrate those for Arvada, and really worked with staff, particularly with Ed and with Carrie, on working through what's the most appropriate, what do you think is feasible, and which of these do you think are kind of a best fit for Arvada. So we worked with them to kind of pare that toolkit down to the 6 recommended strategies that we'll talk through tonight. The first of which is establish a committee to implement the city's affordable housing action plan and support affordable housing development. So this is really, kind of a process, I guess, recommendation, but it really does help set the tone. It helps clarify a vision for housing. It signals to developers kind of what your priorities are around affordability, and it designates an entity to really have ownership over the affordable housing and just the housing strategy in general. And so we would kind of identify 2 key roles for that committee. One would be to set and monitor action items that complete the housing strategy, so really implementation. But then secondly, also serve as an ombudsman or a representative that really helps communicate the strategy to neighborhoods and residents. We've talked a lot about kind of community perception. Certainly, there's a lot of challenges in a metro like ours that's growing so rapidly. There can be a lot of misconceptions around housing. There's a lot of sensitivities around it. So just to have a group that can help be a voice for the city, but also for the residents, really just helping kind of, I guess, grease the wheels in terms of kind of what the city's doing, why the city's doing that, as well as help facilitate some of that engagement for developers that are doing that as well.
Mr. Marriott.
So Molly, I have a question for you. Is this slide assuming that the city has adopted an affordable housing action plan?
Yes, so this would be, we would recommend a committee if you do adopt a housing plan or a housing strategy. It doesn't necessarily have to be termed that way, but we would recommend, as you move into implementation, to designate a committee that helps carry that forward.
Okay, so just so we're clear, the city hasn't adopted an affordable housing action plan or a affordable housing development strategy or anything like that. That it would seem like that would be the first order of business, and then you would go try to implement something that you adopt, not that you would just assume that it's adopted because you studied it like we've done.
Great clarification. Yeah, this is kind of this is a recommendation that would pair with actually adopting a strategy and moving toward implementation. Yes,
Thank you.
Correct. All right, let's go to the next recommendation on the next slide. And that is incorporate additional development incentives to the city's land development code. So as we were working on this study, the city was actually working on their development code as well, and updates to that. We actually worked with the planning department and talked about development incentives. As part of that, the city did include development incentives as part of that process. So we were certainly acknowledging that those were really good efforts, and that those, I think what did get adopted are absolutely kind of the things that we would recommend as primary recommendations. So you've already done a lot of this already. And so really our recommended action on this front for the city is just to continue to monitor those incentives, look to see, track how they're working, whether they're working, how effective they are. And then as you're doing that, we also included a couple other options here that as you evaluate the efficacy of those that are implemented, here's some other options that may help you calibrate those, or that you may want to pair with some of those depending on how they're going. So this is certainly, a task that's already being implemented, and this is just some ways to bolster it and some ways to track it as well. All right, let's go to the next. So our third recommendation is to allocate publicly owned land or consider acquiring vacant or underutilized properties for affordable and mixed income housing. So we're seeing this this is increasingly common among local governments to really take an inventory of land. This is also happening at the state level. In fact, there was state legislation last year that required state level entities to disclose all of the publicly owned land into a database. And so there's multiple steps to this, and we feel like it's fairly low-hanging fruit, at least to evaluate what inventory the city might have in terms of the city's existing land, and really to just consider the feasibility of that for residential development. It may be that the city takes a look and says, no, none of this would work for residential development, and that's fine. So you can see some different steps in terms of the actual recommended actions. But looking at that inventory of existing public land, establishing partnerships with local affordable developers and land trusts, some of which you already have those partnerships as well, evaluating funding sources if you move into acquisition. So this is a very inexpensive recommendation as you talk about land that's already owned by the city or that's underutilized, but it can become an expensive proposition if you start talking about let's actually apply some funds to purchasing or acquiring land. So there's kind of a lot embedded in this recommendation. We would suggest starting with just an inventory and an assessment of the feasibility.
Well, and Molly, we're actually a step beyond that. We're acquiring some underutilized property over by the Walmart and incorporating that with the old city shops that are going to be transferred to the Urban Renewal Authority, working with a developer for a CHAPA project on that site. So
You're ahead of the game. You can check this one off the list then. You're ahead of the game.
Well,
That's great.
certainly that's one example of one we're doing, but the idea of doing the inventory of other possibilities for doing some of that, I think, is an important step. Mr. Marriott?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, didn't we already do that with, and one of the staff members can probably tell me exactly who, is with one of the universities where we did a in-depth study of all the city-owned property, and it led to the transfer of a surplus piece of property down on Carr Street to Habitat for Humanity. But I think we evaluated all the city-owned property for suitability for this. Am I mistaken about that, or is that true?
No, we have taken an inventory. I'm not going to be able to speak to the details, but I can ask Mr. Rusink to jump on here in a minute and clarify at the end of this presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that was with the University of Colorado. Yeah.
Great. So let's jump to the next slide. Recommendation 4 is to implement foreclosure and eviction prevention. So
The governor's already done that.
Great. And this one is particularly timely, I think, with COVID and kind of the impending eviction, potentially eviction challenges. And so looking at funding sources for that, it sounds like you've already allocated to that. CARES Act dollars also can go to that as well. So let's jump to the next, which is the 5th recommendation, and that is establishing a local funding source using commercial and or residential linkage fees or impact fees. So looking at impact fees for affordable housing. We're seeing this, there's a number of communities in Colorado that do this. Denver and Boulder have done it, but Lafayette also has a program that does linkage fees on residential development. And actually Broomfield kind of jumped over this step in very recent years and actually went straight to an inclusionary housing. This is not as, I'd say, taxing on developers as an inclusionary housing program would be, but does give you some type of funding source to dedicate to affordable housing. So our recommended actions on this are to evaluate just the political support and the feasibility of that. Consider the allocation of staff and resources for program compliance. This is one that would require, management on the staff side in a way that would require you to dedicate some resources to it. And then the next step before implementation of something like that would actually be to conduct the nexus study. So it sounds like we may have somebody that was going to jump back in and clarify on the inventory. Is that right? Do you want me to pause for that?
He can jump back in at the end. You can keep going.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. So that's the establishing commercial or residential linkage fees. And then let's go to the next slide, which is the last recommendation. And that is just leveraging your existing resources to facilitate affordable development. So this is kind of a housekeeping one, but just acknowledging affordable housing as a need. And so looking at what resources currently exist in the city and how those can be leveraged. Funding sources coming from lots of different pools can carry some pretty tricky restrictions that include federal funding like CDBG and HODAG, for those who are familiar with those, but really just evaluating those, configuring those, making sure that they're prioritizing the things that you want to prioritize as part of that, including private activity bonds as well, which are state administered. Those are getting more competitive, so just acknowledging that you can be asking more of applicants and making sure that those are all kind of calibrated to make sure that they're leveraged well and that they're really doing for you what you want them to be doing.
Mr. Marriott.
So let's jump oh, go ahead.
Molly, let me just ask you a question about that. My understanding is that the city currently assigns all its private activity bonds to both, used to be Jeffco Housing Authority, now they're called something else, and then also to CHAFA for first-time home buyer assistance and stuff like that. Are you, with this slide, are you saying there are better ways to deploy those private activity bonds, or what do you mean? Because I believe we're deploying them all already in the cause of affordable housing.
Sure.
Why would we do something different than what we're doing?
Only because they are getting, there's increased demand among developers for those private activity bonds, and that gives the city a little bit more leverage to make sure that you can kind of ask for more, essentially, as you're allocating those. And so this actually, recommendation came directly from staff saying, look, we feel like we're getting more and more applications on private activity bonds. That gives us some leverage to make sure that we're asking for the right things, that we can develop a priority list around what we really want those to be used for, as opposed to kind of taking anyone that comes for them.
Okay.
So we'll just jump to the last slide, which actually this graphic actually plots not specific dollar amount cost, but it gives you an idea of kind of which of these recommendations are more expensive. Those are going to be the ones in terms of cost to the city. Moving up in terms of cost goes toward the right of the graphic, and moving up bottom to top shows you scaling in the impact. So how much it's actually going to impact your need. And so it's our goal, of course, to provide you things that are only going to be high impact. We're not going to recommend anything that's really high cost and very low impact. But this just helps plot some of those recommendations to give you a sense of their relative impact and their relative cost. You can see kind of the highest cost item that we've recommended is land acquisition. That's if you kind of move from let's inventory our existing owned land to let's start acquiring land. That tends to be high cost. It can also be high impact. And then, in terms of cost, one of the two kind of lowest cost options to the city are leveraging existing resources and establishing that housing committee, and everything else is kind of in between. So this just gives you kind of a relative sense. Of course, the actual cost and actual impact are really driven by exactly how they're implemented, exactly what the city wants to prioritize and how, but this hopefully gives you a sense of some of the relative interactions between those types of recommendations. And that concludes my presentation, though I'm happy to continue to take questions for across any of these strategies or any of the things that we've discussed. As I mentioned, there's a lot more detail in the report, which I know you will all have in your hands very soon to review, and happy to have questions. If you have questions that come up from that, I'm also happy to address those by email or phone at a later date as well.
Very good. Mr. Marriott.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, and thanks for answering all our questions. I have a couple more. First, I want to say thank you for presenting this overview, and I'm eagerly looking forward to seeing the full report, which we haven't seen yet. But let me ask you a couple questions. So one of the things that strikes me as we have this discussion is that this discussion seems to be largely focused around subsidized housing. There was a little bit in there about, maybe laying the groundwork for just less expensive housing to be developed by what we allow with our code. But a lot of it is around subsidizing housing. And the question I would have is, does the report have in it anywhere that kind of benchmarks Arvada versus other places with the quantity or quantity, the type of subsidized housing that Arvada has compared to other similarly situated communities? So whether that be Arvada versus Golden, Arvada versus Westminster versus Denver versus Greenwood Village versus Colorado Springs, things like that, how we stack up. Is that in the report, or is that something that can be generated from the work you have done?
We did not not include a comparison of publicly assisted housing in comparison communities. We did inventory and talk about the actual affordable housing or subsidized housing, as you say, that is currently in Arvada. So we do talk about the inventory that's currently in Arvada. In terms of comparison to other communities, we kind of lump everything together in terms of looking at market rate affordable units, so naturally occurring affordable housing as combined with publicly assisted housing. So when we show kind of the overall distribution of housing by price point, we have included the housing that has a subsidy attached to it. And so you can really see, but in that comparison, it's less about looking at how much of that stock is actually subsidized and more about what is kind of the net total of both naturally occurring affordable but also subsidized. And so those distribution numbers where we do compare kind of the rental distribution in Arvada to other communities is inclusive of subsidized housing in all of those communities, though it doesn't break it out that way.
Right. Okay. Let me ask you another question then. And the one thing that we haven't seen so far in this discussion is, I don't even know how you would title it, whether you call it subsidized housing policy or how it's operated. My understanding from having other guests here at City Council presenting on various issues around subsidized housing is that the folks who earn or who gain or who get a subsidized housing unit, that it's kind of a once you're in and you're good. Regardless of what happens in your living situation. So someone who qualifies, but then, either obtains more education and obtains a different job or moves forward in their own job or maybe brings in a roommate or has a child that becomes an adult who then is a contributing member of the household, that none of those types of things ever take away their ability to stay in that subsidized housing unit, that there's not kind of a periodic reevaluation and some people who no longer qualify get moved out and opening those for others. And it seems like to me that's a part that should be part of the mix, that you've got even no matter what your strategies are, a limited amount of these affordable units, and that you'd like them to be best deployed to people who actually need them. I don't suspect anything like that is in the report, but within your organization, are there any kinds of papers that you guys have produced or discussions around that subject of kind of keeping those units available for the people who really need them rather than just folks who've been there for a long time?
Yeah, great question. And that is true of deed restricted ownership properties. So if you qualify for a, let's say like a land trust or a habitat type, kind of an ownership product that has an income requirement, then that is true. Even if you start earning more, typically in those programs, you are able to stay in that house. Though there's typically when you sell the house, you don't necessarily reap all of the gains. It depends on how long you live in the house and what the terms are. So that is true of ownership products. That's not actually true of other subsidized rental properties. So typically in a subsidized rental property, anything that's HUD driven or that is like a housing choice voucher, you do have to continue to meet income qualifications in order to retain your space in that development. Now that is, there's certainly anecdotal stories around that not being enforced or not being monitored in a way that actually enforces that. And so there are certainly, to the extent that that's happening, that's a monitoring issue, but it's not typically a program design of rental subsidies that they would just allow you to remain in that subsidized property. So typically those programs have reporting requirement that the renter has to report any income changes, and then they do periodic evaluations of those incomes. So that's not to say that there aren't some people that get around that somehow, or there may be some property managers or property owners that are not enforcing that in a way that is really compliant. But typically the program design would be for rentals that you do have to maintain that income qualification over time.
Okay, thank you. Last question, and that's in amongst these recommendations, there is a variety of ways that essentially you're going to have some people subsidize other people for their housing, whether it be reducing fees to some developers, which means other developers have to pay greater fees, or whether it's giving something to somebody, it comes from somebody, clear down to kind of even more overt ways or more direct ways of subsidy. Are there any of these that are, without trying to just make it more politically palatable, that are more efficient than others for yielding that result? Is it a direct kind of cash payment to somebody to do something, or is it these softer ways like a reduction in fees or things like that? What's the best way, kind of the best practice for deploying these subsidies to achieve the result you want, if the result you want is the greatest quantity of affordable housing being developed?
Yeah, great question, and I wish I had a single answer or a perfect answer. The reality is that different types of programs and different types of subsidies work really well, but for different types of outcomes. And so it really depends kind of on a combination of tools that you're able to use, as well as what needs you really want to meet. And so I would say, there are some of these that are really designed to leverage the private market and say, let's take a look at our zoning code and make sure that we're not constraining the market. It's not always about let's put money into what we want to be built, but let's also make sure that we're not adding barriers or regulation in a way that's already incentivizing something that may not be what we want. And so as you kind of unlock some of the market potential, particularly in that kind of mid-range of housing, that may free up resources, and you may want to designate actual subsidies into those lower price points that the market is never going to meet. And so it's really about providing kind of a combination of both kind of the private market along with where you want to meet those needs. And so I don't necessarily have a great answer for you, because it really does depend on what the city's priorities are and what the city's kind of appetite for how do we want to kind of move some of those priorities, or think about shifting resources toward one or the other. Do we want to incentivize ownership? Do we want to incentivize rental properties, or at what price point? And where can we get the market to act versus where maybe we need city action to address that need?
Thank you.
Very good. I see no other questions. Do we have an update from somebody on our team on the question Mr. Marriott had?
We can. We're going to bring Gordon and maybe Carrie as well back in. Just as a reminder, as I stated at the beginning, this is all the pre-work or the development of the housing strategy, which is a City Council strategic result. So we're in process with the work that we're doing. And with that, I think Gordon is going to come. Carrie.
I would just add that this was a very important step. It's a follow-up to a conversation that started with the survey results. And the council's discussion tonight helps us a lot in terms of framing what to bring forward to you in the final study. There are a number of specific questions that were asked that we'd like to respond back to tonight and in a written follow-up. But Carrie, would you mind starting with a response to the Hometown Colorado initiative and the identification of various parcels in the city and what's happened with that list?
Right. Good evening, Mayor, members of council. It's good to see all of you. As Gordon mentioned, it was the Hometown Colorado initiative completed by the University of Colorado at Denver students that completed that study. And that, I believe, happened back in 2016. We still have the plans that were developed from that study, and we do still use those parcels that were identified in that study as we work with developers in identifying plots of land. But what we're coming across is that the study is now 4 years old, and so we need to consider how a mechanism of keeping that information fresh in our hands, so that as we have developers interested in affordable housing, that we can guide them to the most updated information as far as where they could find potential land for affordable housing.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay. Ms. Gillis, anything else you need from us tonight?
No, I believe we answered all your questions, and we will follow up with writing, but unless council has other questions, we're good to go.
Very good. Anything else tonight, Ms. Gillis?
No, sir. We'll have some follow-up from the questions over the dinner meeting regarding our posting and notification of developers on the Kmart site. I was notified, we have had it out on Nextdoor. That was a question they were specifically answering, but other than that, that's what we're doing right now to notify residents.
Very good.
Other than that.
We stand adjourned. Everybody have a good night.